give you a few updates since that time. We have a new website, so I hope you will visit us at www.jmlibrary.org. And you can find out about our events online on our event page. You can also see items from our collections there online. So stay tuned with our website. Our next lecture will be in April, and we are very lucky to have our April lecturer here at the back. John Cook will be talking about the Virginia Constitution. So please mark your calendars. That will be Wednesday, April 17th. And then the other thing I wanted to just quickly draw your attention to, if you don't know, we offer 6 lectures in our lecture series every year, and you can pick up the card on the table in the lobby. And then look for, this is the 4th lecture. We have 2 more after this, and then our series will begin next year in September. While you're here, I hope you will take a look at our special exhibit, which is celebrating 100 years of the Dunbar branch. The Dunbar branch opened in 1924 at Dunbar High School. It was the first public library service in Lynchburg for African Americans. So we are celebrating the fact that Ann Spencer was a librarian at that branch. It ran as a Jones branch for the first 21 years of its existence, and then it was part of the Lynchburg City Schools. So you can read about that story. You can also see it online. If you don't have time to see it in person, feel free to visit it online. But it is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. T.J. Anderson III. Born in Guthrie, Oklahoma, poet and musician T.J. Anderson III is the author of poetry collections, There It Is, Devante Travels the Sorry Route, sorry, I need my glasses, Cairo Workbook, and River to Cross. Also the critical book, Notes to Make the Sound Come Right, 4 Innovators of Jazz Poetry, and the recording Blood Octave. A former Fulbright U.S. scholar in Cairo, Egypt, he has also had fellowships with the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and McDowell. He is a full professor at Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia, and he is here tonight with his wife, and we are just delighted to have them both here. And without further ado, Dr. T.J. Anderson.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and see some familiar faces and some not so familiar faces, but all smiling, so that makes me feel good. So when I was a child, my family lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and when we were leaving from Nashville to go visit my grandparents in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, we would oftentimes pass the exit signs for Lynchburg and Roanoke. Right? I live in Roanoke now, and always, when I was a little kid, I would look out the window of the green station wagon, and I would say, "Roanoke, is that the lost colony?" Right? It's not the real lost colony. And then I would see this sign for Lynchburg, and it would pop up, and my dad would say, "That's where your people come from, right? That's where your great-grandfather came from there. That's where your grandfather was born." But we never really stopped there. We just kind of kept going up to Coatesville to see my grandparents. But one of the things that when I moved down here from Binghamton to New York to teach at Hollins University, I always thought of the Blue Ridge Mountains as being some kind of geographical kind of welcome. Welcome arms, welcome place, welcome site as I kind of drove into this area. And so this is a poem that I wrote just kind of thinking about the past and what was it like. A lot of my research into my great-grandfather is historical in a lot of ways. It's also oral tradition, it's a lot of archival research, but a lot of it is based on the imagination. Right? I try to bridge these 2 things, have the imagination talk to me as well as the critical things, and see what kind of picture they can paint, right? So this is kind of an opening of coming in, and the Silaji, if you're not familiar, is the name for the Cherokee people. I know this is monogamy. So it's called Picaresque.
Blue Ridge Mountain Push-Up, the Salaji called it Shah Kon Ajay, meaning land of the blue mist. Green hills, gold trees, oak leaf temples, clouds that swirl, swallowtails floating above dandelion line. What was that like? So the only picture that I have of my great-grandfather is this one. And this is actually a picture of a picture. It was taken, it's really interesting to me because part of the corners have kind of worn away and it looks like it was propped against some kind of wooden building or a wooden wall. So I'm always curious about what is the story behind that wall and why the picture is kind of placed there. So I have no other images that I know of my great-grandfather, except for this picture. And this is, he's in a Masonic uniform. He was a secretary of this, I think the Prince Hall Masons, this fraternal organization, service organization. And I'll tell you more about him as we progress. So, well, I got out of high school in 1976. 10 years after that, I got the genealogy bug, right? I became really curious about my family. Who were they? What did they do? And so forth. And my mom is a librarian, and she's a genealogist, so she was always recording information about my family trees and stuff, and saving articles. And everything was in a file with my mom, you know. Great-grandfather Anderson, boom, file of stuff, you know. The Turpo family, which is on my dad's side, you know, a file of stuff, right? And so I went through this file, and I saw this about my great-grandfather here, and it comes from the Lynchburg Bicentennial, 1786 to 1986. There was apparently an organization, I don't know if it still exists, a black organization called the Lynchburgers Club, Ambassadors of Goodwill, Lest We Forget, right? And it named all these important figures, black African-American figures within the black community. And here's the information that I got about my great-grandfather, right? I can't read, let's see. The late Mr. Anderson was the son of slave parents. It says when he served on the City Council, etc. He was on the almshouse at the Old City Cemetery and Methodist Cemetery as well. So this was the thing that kind of sparked my interest and sparked my curiosity. So one of these things, when your intention is to explore your history and so forth, and your genealogy, sometimes it takes a while to kind of get to that because you've got your regular job, right? You've got teaching and responsibilities and so forth. And my mother always told me, and I wholeheartedly believe this, she says, sometimes the ancestors call, right? And I can tell you stories of the insistency of my great-grandfather saying, come to Lynchburg, do this story, talk about me, remember me, and so forth. And so on Holland's campus, on the front quad, we have these millstones here. And these millstones once belonged to the Hollands family. And interestingly enough, my great-grandfather might have lived on Holland Street, right? So there were all of these signs around me. Okay, millstone, got to track down my great-grandfather. And so I had the name. I knew he worked at Old City Cemetery. And I decided to call up Old City Cemetery and say, do you have information on my great-grandfather? He worked at the cemetery. He was a supervisor here. Do you know anything about him? And the person who answered the phone was Jane Babber White. I don't know if you know Jane, right? She says, there was a pause, and she said, you wouldn't believe this. Right now, I'm putting your great-grandfather's name on a plaque, this very moment, right? And we're having a ceremony in honor of the caretakers. Can you come? Right? And that was going to be that Saturday, right? So I rushed down here and met Jane and so forth. And then I met some distant relatives who were here and so forth. And I eventually found out where my great-grandfather was buried because I asked Jane and realized that he wasn't buried in Old City Cemetery. But here's the name of my great-grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Anderson, and the dates he was at the cemetery caretaker, and his address is 400 Taylor Street. 400 Taylor Street was the house provided by the cemetery for the caretakers. So that's why you'll see 400 written down there. I think it still stands. It's right by one of the back gates there on Taylor Street. And my great-grandfather lived on the 700 block of Taylor Street in Roanoke. In Lynchburg. He eventually bought a house down there. So I had this information, had this connection with Jane. Interestingly enough, Jane was a graduate of Hollins University, right, where I was teaching, right? And Jane mentioned that there was this new library on Hollins campus, and Jane says, I very rarely come to Hollins because when they built the new library, they covered up my garden, and I was so heartbroken, right? So I realized that Jane had this real intimate, this kind of connection with the land and the landscape and nature and so forth. Really personally felt that. So it was wonderful to kind of walk Old City Cemetery and talk with Jane about the flora and fauna and who's buried there. So whenever, as a poet, when I put together a poem, there are a few things that I take in mind consideration. That this research for me my plan was as a poet, how do I approach research as a poet? What are the things that I look for? Because my idea was that the final result would be I would create a poem about my great-grandfather or a collection of poems, because that's how I process things. So as a poet, a couple of things that we're concerned about. We're concerned about form. What does a poem look like? How does it appear on the page, right? How do we use space, right? How do we use silence? Silence becomes an important part of poetry. What's not said, what's implied. Also, whether we use rhyme, repetitive vowel sounds, all of these things, how it sounds, right? So as I was thinking about this poem, I also started thinking about the scaffolding or the architecture of a research, what that looks like as the architecture of a poem, right? And so what I did was I kind of made a list of things that I knew about my great-grandfather, things that I wanted to explore further, or things that I wanted to speculate on, right? Like I said, there are so many serendipitous moments in my search for my great-grandfather that I would ascribe as being mystical in a way, certainly spiritual in a way, right? And there comes a point where you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen in your search, because that can be frustrating. You just have to somehow move aside and let it happen, right? Kind of let the mix happen, right? There's a great phrase by an African American who was enslaved part of the Gullah Islands. And he said that most people talk about mystery, he says, but for us it's mixtery, M-I-X-T-E-R-Y. And I thought that was a really good way to kind of encapsulate what my research is, and mixing these various genres or these various ways of discourse, right? So these are some of the information that I had. He is popularly known as Jefferson Anderson. That was the name when he was on the City Council. But his full name is Thomas Jefferson Anderson. He was one of 5 African Americans to serve on the Lynchburg City Council, 1885 to 1889 for 2 terms. He served on the Almshouse, Cemetery, and Sanitary Affairs, representing the 1st and 3rd wards. The other African American councilmen were Henry Edwards, John Crawford, John Wilson, and James Merchant. More information. Jefferson Anderson had a common school education, not high school. So there was talk in family oral history about Jefferson Anderson, Thomas Jefferson Anderson, kind of being one of the better, well-read people in the family, and a lot of people went to him for kind of advice and counsel. So I was curious about that, particularly because, as I'll talk about later, education became a real kind of founding point, touchstone in our family. He operated a grocery business at Madison and 12th Streets. He was made superintendent of Methodist Cemetery, Old City Cemetery, July 1st in '89. He was married to Fanny Carter, 1866 to 1893. She would have been my great-grandmother. Jackson Street United Methodist Church, November 1882. They had 3 children, Robert, Thomas, J., my grandfather, and Louise. His second, after Fanny Carter died, he married his second wife almost a year later, and they owned a house on Taylor Street. And he was the oldest son, my great-grandfather, of John Anderson Montcastle, and, according to family story, an unknown slave woman, right? So there's been, I'll talk more about this, but there's been speculation that family oral tradition says that the woman was Sioux, right? And I take that to mean the Sioux linguistic group, right? Not the Lakota Sioux in the Midwest, but the Sioux linguistic group, which would have been the Monicans, right? Or the Tutelo and stuff like that, right? It's really, sometimes it gets really hard to trace this history. You know, we are on the 100th anniversary, 1924, of the Racial Integrity Act, right? If you don't know about that, that was an act in what was the Board of Health? Yes?
What do you mean by those words, found child? I don't understand that.
Okay. So, yeah, I'll talk about that in a minute, but what happened to him was I believe it was his father, right? My great-great-great-grandfather brought home this child, a found child, a lost child, didn't know who the mother was, and told his wife, "You take care of this child," right? So they didn't really know who his mother was.
Oh.
So that's what it means to be
They
a
just
found.
found it in a, how did they
Well, I
find it?
don't know if the mother couldn't take care of the child for various reasons. I don't know if the child was born out of wedlock. I'm not exactly sure, but my great-great-grandfather felt responsible to kind of take care of this child. He sent his second son, my grandfather, to Phillips Exeter Academy, and his daughter to Boston Conservatory. Born 1853, died age 67, 1130. Some things I've seen, brochures that would talk about him, earlier ones that were from 1970s, would say he was one of Lynchburg's oldest living African-American citizens. He lived to be 100, right? Not true. 67, right? And he's buried at White Rock Cemetery. Do you all know where White Rock is? White Rock is one of the 7 hills of Lynchburg, right? It's the historically black cemetery where Otabanga is buried. So I know you can't see this, and this will look really blurry to you, but I'll explain some things that kind of caught my attention. So this name here is John Anderson Montcastle. And this would be my great-great-grandfather, who was married to Angeline Braxton Gregory, right? And up here, there's some notes about the various members of the family. Here are his 10 kids. My grandfather right here, Thomas Jefferson Anderson, born in Campbell County, but it was Amherst County, I found out. Buried in City Cemetery. He's buried in White Rock. So this lists all of his kids: Thomas Jefferson, Robert, John, Sarah, etc., and it kind of goes down. But if you could see this would say Jeff was the oldest of 10 children and was a found child. And it mentions that it was given to his father, and Angeline was told to take care of this child. So that's the mystery of my great-grandfather, right? I don't know, who the mother was, and I've always been looking for that name to track down. This is the family tree of my great-grandfather, right? So we have his name, Jefferson Anderson, his birth date's Amherst County. It mentions his second wife, Mary Miles. It mentions this name, Fanny Carter, who is who would be my great-grandmother, and she is the mother of Robert Anderson, his first son, Tom J. Anderson, which is my grandfather, and Louise Anderson. And all of this information was found in our family Bible. And one of the things that's really important was these little worksheets, right? Because you really have to depend on the community and family, right, to keep records, right, and to keep track of things and so forth. So I am grateful to my mother and the Bondurants and Spencer's families, who kind of made notes of all of these things, who copied all of things. So I had access to these things, and it really kind of helped on my search. This is my great-grandfather. This is the 1880 census after the first death of his first wife. Here you see he's 28 years old. Lynchburg. I interested in here. This is from 1880. He's listed as mulatto. This changes in other things. He becomes black in a later one, and so forth. And it has him listed as a widower. He's living with the Roberts family, and then here he is, 28 years old, with Edmund and Emily Roberts. So one of the things about this mulatto thing, and I was mentioning the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, and this was, of course, was happening earlier, and a lot of these records, specifically from Monacan people and indigenous people, oftentimes they had to put down black, right, or white, but mainly it was black. And there was this whole argument about representation, right? And how is the tribe being represented? How is the community being represented? And how is it being erased, right? And this all comes back, if you go back to Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, when he talks about getting rid of indigenous people by having them kind of be absorbed in kind of mainstream Western white culture, right? But kind of denying that Indianness presence, right? Jefferson's attacked on black intellect too. So all of these things, but all of these kind of ideas go in this mix about the way that people are portrayed, or the way that history is recorded, and so forth, and who has the power to make these particular decisions. So we also have him listed as a retail merchant. And this is when he owned this small grocery business. Here he is again. This is the 1900 census with his second wife, Mary, right? Now, 1900s. He's listed as black here, had his household. They've been married for 5 years, right? We have his name, but on the census, he's putting his name down as Jeff Anderson, right? Not Thomas Jefferson Anderson. So that's kind of disappearing, right? Here's his wife, Mary, right? Here's his oldest son, Robert Anderson, right? There's a speculation, why would you name your first son Robert Anderson and your second son Thomas J. Anderson? Well, Teresa Harris, where's Teresa? Right, and thank you. Yeah, she did a play recently sponsored by the Legacy Center for African American History Month, and did a piece about my great-grandfather. And she said correctly that we think my great-grandfather admired he had a younger brother named Robert he was really close to. So in honor of his younger brother, he named his firstborn after Robert, right? That's what we speculate on. So here's my my grandfather at 11 years old, little 11, baby in the family. Here's his sister, Louise Anderson, a little bit more about her. And Joanna Ferris, who I'm not sure she is, but she's 83 years old, which is pretty old for that time. I'm not sure if she's a relative or what. I mean, that would involve some more searching. Do you all know this place? Yes, yes. So I had the pleasure this afternoon to be shepherded through this wonderful place by Miss Grace Dean and Miss Annabelle Tweedy for the Jackson Street United Methodist Church. And this is the spiritual home of my ancestors, right? And I come from a family that ultimately all academics, right? My grandfather started a school in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, the James Adams School. I'll talk more about that, right? My father has a PhD. He's a composer. You know, I've got a PhD. My daughter has a PhD. I've got cousins who've got, you know, all educated, right? But, you know, one of the important things about education within the black community is this idea of service, right? It's not like you're doing these things for self-serving or kind of your own embellishment, but it's the idea, the value of literacy, something that was forbidden, the idea of taking literacy and what you learn and spreading it to other people, right? So other people can kind of take that value, to see the value in reading, to see the value in discussing literature, to see the value in being able to critique a painting, right? To be able to extend that, to go into a place, you know, say a restaurant or a hotel, and be able to understand what's happening by your understanding of having read books or have seen art, right? It becomes an important foundation for education. So this was founded in Jackson Street in 1866, and Ms. Dean tells me that my great-grandfather was a trustee of the church, and she showed me this document, and then also he was an education leader, right? He was an education leader, and I understand there were, when he was there were like over 186 students who were enrolled, right? And this kind of became this gathering place where, you know, the Bible, I assume the Bible was discussed and so forth. And it was also this kind of community thing where people were able to, you know, check in with the young kids and inspire them and kind of see what they're doing and witness their talents and find ways to kind of nurture them and watch that develop. In front of the church, there is this plaque, the Virginia Teachers Association, the Virginia Teachers Reading Circle, which was established in 1887 at the Jackson Street Methodist Episcopal Church. So there's this marker here. And like Ms. Dean told me, you know, everybody who's been a teacher comes out of Jackson Street Church kind of thing, right? So there's this center of education. And when I stepped on the grounds and stepped in the church, it was palpable. I could really feel it, right? I feel that the sense that those, you know, if you believe that sound continues, that it's not destroyed, right? I believe that sound vibrates, and those voices who are in celebration and joy and so forth, all of those stories are still kind of contained in that wood, right? And when you walk in, you just feel those vibrations of floors of people coming up the stairs, or people listening to the sermon and all that. It's very, very palpable, very, very powerful, right? And those are those moments that really excite me and kind of get me engaged about this kind of quest to find more about my great-grandfather. So, 1906 was when, if I'm not mistaken, the Jones Library was built, if I'm not mistaken, 1906. And it was a segregated library. It was a library for mainly white people. And I haven't seen the Dunbar Library exhibit, but what happened was there was the Dunbar School, named after the great poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, and there was this building called the Dunbar Library. And the great Harlem Renaissance era poet Anne Spencer was the librarian there, right? So, and also, I kind of like people talk about the Harlem Renaissance, right? They oftentimes think about Harlem, USA, and New York, and yes, that was an important part of it. But we have to realize that there were satellites that were part of the Harlem Renaissance, that what was called by Dr. Elaine Locke the New Negro movement, right? This new way of African Americans kind of writing about black subjects, about painting pictures with black people, writing about the rural South like Zora Neale Hurston does, or Jane Toomer's book Cane, right? Experimenting with novel and poetry and all of this. And W.B. Du Bois, important leader, editor of the Crisis magazine, founding member of the NAACP, right? So there was this, again, around this period, there was this interest in education, this kind of more flourishing of education and responsibility. Also, you have part of this is what is called the Great Migration. You've all heard of the Great Migration, in which a lot of African Americans moved from the South to go north, mainly because of racism and discrimination, etc., economic exploitation. So this is one of the first times I see my grandfather's name in the record. Thomas Jefferson Anderson, Jr., right? Remember that, Jr. When I had my announcement thing, it said T.J. Anderson III, right? But just remember, my grandfather was Junior. This is where it gets confusing, right? And wife of 713 Taylor Street is a young colored man who is credit to the Lynchburg Colored High School, of which he is a graduate of the class of 1905. As he has taken the first scholarship of his class at Phillips Exeter Academy, New Hampshire, one of the oldest schools in New England, he is spending his Christmas holidays in Boston, with his sister Louise Anderson, who is attending the Boston Conservatory of Music. Right, she was a pianist. Right, so here's my grandfather moving up north, and my grand aunt up north in Boston. And one of the things I have to think about that just kind of intrigues me, and the books were so important to my grandfather, is the idea that there was a library here, the Jones Library, which he couldn't go into, right? He would go into the Dunbar, of course. But later on in life, when he bought this house, 431 Cedar Street in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, large house, he had this large room which he called his library, right? And in there he had a full set of the Harvard classics, right? From Plato to Socrates to maybe it goes up to T.S. Eliot. I forgot how far. It doesn't go, maybe not that far. But he had the whole full set. He had encyclopedias called The History of Humankind. He had books on philosophy and so forth. And it was in this kind of glass room. And when I would come and visit, I would just sit in this dusty room and kind of pour through the books. And it was kind of this magical place. They'd leave me alone and let me explore, right? So it was it all started here. It started at that, Jackson Street Church, and it went when my grandfather moved to Exeter, Phillips Exeter. And this is my grandfather on the cover of the magazine, the Coatesville Record. Coatesville, does anybody know Coatesville? Yeah? Okay, good, yeah. So Coatesville is mainly a steel mill town, and maybe it's a steel town. Working class, I know there's a big VA center there, but it's predominantly a working class city, kind of a bit hilly too. So this was put on, so this was put on the cover of the Coatesville Record, and it talks a little bit about him and his education. And one of the important things, like I said, how important it is that my grandfather did was after Phillips Exeter, he attended Howard University, and he was a close friend of Paul Robeson. They were on a name basis, and he would also come and visit him. And I think also my grandfather's political ideology came from a lot of what Robeson was talking about. So that was really influential. He also, in Coatesville, founded a school called the James Adams School, and it was a school for African American folks. And they had a literacy program in the evening, and they had regular school for the young people and so forth. And they helped, if people needed money or needed, places to stay, like where their house became like a halfway house, in a way. But it was always a sense of community. And the motto for this James Adams School was, "Can I help you?" Kahu, right? "Can I help you?" And there's a statue for him in Coatesville, and a plaque that talks about the importance of that school. But to make the point, it all started here, right? It all started at that Jackson Street church. This is my father, 95 years old, composer. He grew up in Coatesville, started off as a jazz musician, but trumpet player, and later on went to more kind of classical music, got his PhD from the University of Iowa. He's a member of the Academy of Arts and Letters. If you Google his name, you can see all of the various recordings that he's done. He's set a lot of poems to music. He's written operas and so forth, very prolific. But one of the things that my father has always told me, he says it's the responsibility of the artist to document the culture. And that has always kind of stayed with me as my mission as a poet and as a teacher and stuff. It's like I have to speak, I have to talk about what I've uncovered and what I've seen, right? So this comes from my father, and also comes from that long legacy of education, right? So remember when I said my grandfather was listed as Thomas Jefferson Anderson Jr., right? So here I am, the 3. So actually, I really should be listed as the 4th, right? So when I was born, my Aunt Louise, my grandfather's sister, sent this card, hope TJ3 is fine. By the way, the baby is TJ4. My father was TJ also, but he was called Jefferson Anderson. Anyway, he is TJ4, and that gives us an extra claim on him. So there it is. That's the evidence. That's all I needed, right? As I mentioned before, I was trying to find out the name of my grandfather's, great-grandfather's wife, the unknown woman, the woman who could have been Monacan or whatever. And I finally got a name. Let's see, the name is right here. Eliza Tusker, or Tusher, Eliza Tusker, Amherst County. So I finally got that name, and there it is. I've done some searches for it, but no luck. I've been trying to find out who that was and what the story is, and I've been, looking at, indigenous record keeping and trying to find names and stuff. And there are some similar, I know there's some Andersons, but there are some similar names, but no Tusker or Tusher, so I'm not exactly sure who that is, and I have nobody to ask, of course. So he's buried in White Rock Cemetery, my great-grandfather, and pretty much every year around February 11th or around my birthday, I come up to White Rock Cemetery and I look for his tombstone, right? Because I can't find it, right? The first time I went there years ago, over 10 years ago, it was a while back, the cemetery was kind of beautiful in a way. It was being taken over by these beautiful periwinkles, right? And they had kind of sculpted themselves around the stones, and they were flowering, and you'd see deer and so forth. It was kind of idyllic in a way. And then I would come later on, and I would see people, working on clearing the space and trying to find, relatives or, plotting out the tombstones. And I remember that at one point I came across a man who was cutting the grass, and I talked to him for a bit, and he said he was an African-American guy, and he says he's a retired police officer, and he was looking for the grave of his son, right? But things were so overgrown that he couldn't remember where it was, right? So, and it's one of the interesting things about not finding great-grandfather's grave is the sense of kind of exploring and saying those names and discovering the people who are there, and like, oh, this person fought in the Spanish-American War. I wonder what this story was. Oh, this person, there's a Masonic thing on this part. I wonder who this was. Oh, Otabanga was buried here, and so forth. But it became this wonderful kind of landscape, a trajectory where I kind of moved myself through the grass and through the dirt and the pebbles of history, right? And if you're coming, I believe this is coming from Taylor Street, but entering into Old City Cemetery, I would often come through these archways and think about my great-grandfather, right? And thinking about where he walked, what he saw and what he thought of as I looked for these, as I kind of connected with these old trees, right? You see these trees that are over 100 years old, and you say, oh, that's the same tree that my great-grandfather might have stopped under, right? This thing is still living, right? Isn't that amazing? As Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman would say, isn't that remarkable? So this has become a kind of talisman, if you will, for me, where I have a picture of my great-grandfather in his Masonic uniform, and next to him is my grandfather. And I have these two pictures on my dresser, right? I kind of have them in my office, and it serves as a kind of a reminder of where I come from, and the importance of achievement and integrity, right, coming from that. And so, okay, what time? And so I wrote this poem, which I will read to you. So this poem is called This Our Passing, White Rock Cemetery and Old City Cemetery. This morning, the morning sun washes cold slabs of the dead who proudly guard the gray road that marks my entrance. Nestled in tangles of periwinkle, this White Rock Cemetery with its relics of tombstones like chipped and broken teeth clotting the earth. I see a strong, loose-limbed black man trimming the grass. Could this have been you, great-grandfather, standing at the lawn's edge of Old City Cemetery between pebble and path? What it must have been like to walk those rows, pick those weeds from some of the very people who may not have seen you as a man. Those who wouldn't invite you to sit down with them at the dinner table for a well-appointed meal, perhaps the very same who caused you to tip your hat across the street when one of their bells came striding through. But they are under the dirt now, no longer stepping out of wagons and Model T Fords, wearing bonnets or wide-brimmed hats to block out the sun. The heat is on them, on this land where you pushed your clippers under the compost of leaves and city council papers, where you pushed your pen and signed your name. At this age, you notice things. The way the late moon morning slowly vanishes behind the willows. The way the sun comes rising up to give light on the opening of what you hope will be a new day for all of us. Locomotive engines on tracks, lonely whistles that called your children to pack their bags and move north, a place you've never been. I know why you let them go. You staying here to work the rot gates. You staying here to assist a customer with brilliantly red apples, brown grains of wheat, stew meat, and rhubarb from your market stall. Oh, great-grandfather, it is always here that I see you, standing between the long-limbed trees and bright celestial sun, between the clouds of freedom that telegraph your dreams. Beloved father, husband, churchgoer, and councilman, image of you rising to appear in a poem, census records, clotted ink script on a death certificate. Were your children there to send you off? Who took up their places behind the coffin-carrying carriage to hold up flowers to surveys Lynchburg's 7 hills, rising and falling off the backs of the enslaved as well as the free? The James River courses its way, snakes through your life, which is now mine, like the horses that pull the coffin, the truck that brings that extra dirt to fill in the whole 6 feet. What was it like to stand at the borders of stone pathways and manicured lawns, to witness the lines where we salute the dead, to hear the shudder of falling leaves, to see the same ancient oak that witnesses our passing?
So that's a kind of a poem that kind of comes out of this, you know. As you know, my great-grandfather did serve on the city council, and one of the things that's important about being on the Alms committee and the sanitary committee was that he was in those committees to really help people, right, and to really make a difference and to be vocal about the role of the black community. This period was an important upswing of black political activity. You know, he worked with the person who was running with Harry Edwards in the 3rd Ward, and they canvassed, they went around all these houses, and they made this change, they facilitated this change, right? And so what I hope in this poem and in this talk is certainly to recognize that change and know that change is still here. We embody it in different ways. You know, we walk this city that has such an old and rich and vibrant history, right? But to see kind of how things change, right? How things are capable of change, changes how things move. And some of those people who have made, you know, the first plants, if you will, those who have made those steps, and those people who have taken great risks, right? You know, that shouldn't be forgotten. You know, the risk that my great-grandfather took to run for the city council, the risk that he took to vote against something that the majority might have voted for, right? Great risk to do that, right? The risk of my grandfather living as a young black kid in Lynchburg, and the fear of racial terror and what could possibly happen to a young black boy in the South, not only the South, but other places, right? So we've, you know, there's a lot of movement and a lot of that talent kind of left Lynchburg, right? And some of it still is here, but Lynchburg represents this kind of spiritual home, this kind of brick and mortar home, and also within the imagination, this place of flowering and flourishing, right? So this is a thank you to everybody who kind of helped. My wife, Pauline Caldas, was instrumental in putting the PowerPoint there. I'm a nervous wreck when it comes to technology, but I thank everybody who kind of helped me, and it was wonderful to hear these stories and to be here. when I was in residency at the Virginia Center for the Arts, I was working on my Lynchburg project, right? So I also came to this library and sat at probably that very desk looking at microfiche and kind of, tracking down who my great-grandfather was and kind of coming back and just walking around and being in this space, So I have a particular affection for Lynchburg and my roots. And I used a little bit of critical resources. There's an excellent master's thesis from Harry Ferguson on Negro in politics in 1865 that extensively talks about my great-grandfather and his work on the City Council, in particular votes that he was responsible for. E. Franklin Fraser, The Free Negro Family Study of Family Origins Before the Civil War, not particularly applicable to my great-grandfather who was enslaved earlier, but the idea of kind of looking at what were some of the choices and what was some of the movement of people who were free and how did they work with formerly enslaved or enslaved people, thinking about that. Of course, Lucy Harrison Miller, Weber, Jane White's mother, I believe, Behind the Old Brick Wall, The Cemetery Story of Lynchburg. It was one of the first books I had about the City Cemetery and kind of walking around thinking about who was buried there and the history of these tombstones and so forth. And then my cousin, Janita Richardson, has written a book about my grandfather and grandmother who started the James Adams Community School. So those are my people. That's my gift to the ancestors. That's deep gratitude. And I'm willing to answer questions if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
I thought about this before and during your poem that you read finally, but is it the understanding in your family that when your great-grandfather sent his children up to school, he encouraged them to make their lives there or to stay?
I don't know. I don't know if he expected them to come back. I know that my grandfather never ever came back to Lynchburg. Never. And I don't think he came back for his father's funeral, And so I've asked my father, did the grandfather say anything about great-grandfather? He said, no, he doesn't talk about it much. So I don't know if there was some tension or some friction between the two of them, And I also wonder what were the possibilities of being, like, say, going north, going to Phillips Exeter, being highly educated for a black person, and to return to Lynchburg? What would be available for them, right? So it was almost like, if you want to grow as an artist, like my Aunt Louise, right, in this way, then you have to kind of go north. You have to be away from here. Maybe, my great-grandfather saw a kind of ceiling, where things were kind of impossible to achieve, or were long one coming, I should say. Thank you. Yes?
Do you know why your father was named Junior too? So your father and your grandfather are both Junior.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea why that is. I wonder if it was because, and I might be wrong with this, it was because my great-grandfather's first son was Robert and his second son was Thomas Jefferson Anderson. I wonder, by doing that, if he was kind of starting it all over again, right? Maybe, I don't know, because, but then in the newspaper thing it says Junior, right? But my grandfather always T.J. Anderson Sr., right? So I mean, yeah.
That's just,
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know why that choice was made. Yes, sir.
Have you ever gone up to Phillips Exeter to see what records they might still have?
No, I haven't had the opportunity to do that. Yeah.
They probably have something.
Yeah, I do plan on going up and seeing what he was doing there and so forth. Yeah, definitely. Anything else? Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming home.
Oh.
Delighted to have you here. So our next lecture is in April, Virginia Constitutions. Please help yourself to some cookies and punch on your way out.